Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the supportive viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Springfield at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, where they have a distinction of having just completed their 1,000th oral history interview. Dr. Mark Depew, when you came, lo these many years ago, did you think you'd reach 1,000, or did you even think about 1,000?
I didn't think we'd ever get to 1,000. I had the goal right from the beginning that if we're going to collect interviews about Illinois history, and these are going to be in-depth interviews, they're going to be quality interviews. That was my first goal. And the second goal was to make sure they're as accessible as possible. So they're all on the internet. Almost all of them are available. And some of that is audio, some of that is video, and a lot of those are also with transcripts as well. But 1,000 interviews, I didn't think I'd get there.
We're going to help you with the accessibility because you're going to loan us 5 of those clips for this particular program. This particular program is called Veterans Remember. And you did, I mean, you have done hundreds of veterans interviews, and you chose 5 for us for this program, so we're very pleased you did that.
Yeah, and we're starting with one of the favorite interviews that I've done, but almost everybody else you talk to who really loves the veterans, they love Vince Speranza because he is a master storyteller, and so we're going to start with his clip. And this is one that most people aren't familiar with. A lot of people know about his bear story, and they're going to have to check the webpage to find
to
out
see
about
that one, huh?
This is him at the end of the war singing Lily Marlene to a woman when they're not supposed to be fraternizing with the Germans.
Okay, well, let's take a look.
Early one morning, I'm out there, and I'm cleaning my rifle yet again. It's early. And from upstairs, I hear a rather melodious female voice singing. Vor du Kaserne, vor dem großen Tor, steht ein Laterne und steht die noch davor. Alle Leute sollen es sehen, wenn wir bei der Laterne stehen, wie einst Lili Marleen, bist du Lili Marleen. And I'm looking, and I don't see anything. She's up there, I looked around, but then, as now, I had my trusty harmonica, and I responded. Well, she stuck her head out.
And why wouldn't she?
And she smiled. And she said, Devant la caserne, quand le jour s'enfuit, s'il allait la terre, soudain s'allume lui. C'est dans ces coins que l'espoir est s'entendait, rempli d'espoir, tout doux Lili Marleen, tout doux Lili Marleen. Now, you know, there's a non-fraternization policy. We're not supposed to talk to the German. We're not supposed to have anything to do with them while the war's on. And how do I respond to that? I said, underneath the lamppost by the village, what the hell are the rest of the words? I don't know, la 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 la. And she started laughing like hell. She laughed, and I waited, and she went, verboten. And that was the end of that.
Verboten. Is Vince still with us?
Oh, he very much is with us. He travels around the country. Every year he goes to Bastogne for the anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. He's like the last surviving paratrooper. He was in the 101st
Really?
Paratroops there at the Battle of the Bulge.
Mm-hmm.
And as you can tell, he is a master storyteller. And this is one of the scores that I got. I got him singing in Italian, and he's Italian extraction. And I got him telling a great joke in the greatest Scottish brogue you ever heard. So,
He's got everything except he didn't know the English.
yeah, isn't that amazing? I can't remember the words in English.
Well, listen, it was very, very cold for that winter of the Battle of the Bulge. And a lot of soldiers and a lot of their families will also remember the Chosin Reservoir for that inhuman weather that they had to go through.
Yeah, that's a Korean War story, obviously. And when I first got to the program, I wanted to do more Korea than World War II, because everybody has done World War II. The public still loves this stuff, and I've gotten great material in World War II, but I really had a passion to go after the Korean War interviews. Bernie Goulet of Springfield, Illinois, was one of the first ones, and he was in the 7th Infantry Division, I believe, at the Chosin Reservoir. He had been in Japan before that time, and then immediately got sent over to Korea once the war started. And of course, as some people know, I mean, it got down to the Pusan perimeter, and then we drove all the way north, all the way close to the Yalu River, and then the Chinese, hundreds of thousands of Chinese came in and overwhelmed the Americans there. The Marines, 1st Marine Division, has a very distinct story from that. That's one of their proudest moments, because even though they were overwhelmed, they were able to get all of their troops out, their equipment out in most cases, and even the casualties out. But what you're going to be hearing here Bernie talking about is the saddest thing he saw in Korea, and it was the cemetery at Hungnam, where all these dead were coming back and being buried. And the really poignant part about that is we had to leave them there, because we evacuated shortly after that. So as far as I know, they're still there.
If I were asked to describe what was the saddest thing I ever saw in Korea, it would be my experience in that area up there, Hungnam and Hamhung. The Marines, I think, were in charge of setting up this cemetery. I seem to remember their people being back there, a lot of them. And there were Army people working on it too, I believe. And there was a pretty bustling little cemetery, because they were bringing a lot of people back from the Chosin area, truckloads, as a matter of fact. And they must have been back at the tail of our column that came in there, because these trucks kept arriving for a while afterward. But anyway, the trucks kept coming, and they were stacked with dead people, with dead Marines, GIs, and they would turn in there at that Hamhung cemetery, and that was such a sad little cemetery. They had a little American flag there, that there was always a sort of a breeze, and that flag was always stretched out tight, waving there, and that made such an impression on me that I get very impatient when I see the flag being insulted, all today even. And oh boy, the Marines would unload those trucks, you know, and I mean, there was arms, legs sticking out in every direction from those doggone things. The guys were frozen, I guess, or in surely the rigor had worn off by then. It must have been freezing. And they'd get up, you know, and toss them down. So they'd toss them down, and then the matter of putting them in the body bag and doing the correct marking and use of the dog tags and that bit. But I know they did everything very methodically and carefully. They handled the guys as reverently as they could, but that wasn't always, you know, real lightly, because they had a lot to do, and they didn't know how long we were going to be there, or whether we were going to be left to operate like that. They were all marked, and they all had the cross, or whatever it was they needed, or the star.
Listening to Bernie, I know Bernie personally, and he's quite a singer. I don't know if you knew that, but he sings in my church choir. He's a very sensitive man, And I imagine this pretty much tore him up, having to
You
watch
could
this.
hear the emotion in his voice when he was talking about that flag. And it reminds you of all the things that we get involved and talk about today. But he had this amazing experience that first year. That first year in Korea was brutal. And you know, you start with maybe 20, 40 people in your platoon, and maybe you end the year with 5 or 6 that are still remaining. And he had those kind of stories to tell. But nothing was quite as powerful as this particular clip,
Yeah.
I thought.
And to have to go from Japan, which would have been much suffering there as well, and then to go to North Korea would have been.
They were living the high life,
tough.
Mark. They were living the high life.
Well,
in
the war
Japan.
was over, of course, and
Yes.
but still, it would have been a pretty well. Okay.
They weren't. Here's the lesson of that. They weren't ready for hard combat. They had gotten soft
Is that
on
right?
occupation duty in Japan.
Speaking of tough times, in Vietnam, we were all familiar with Senator McCain's situation, and it became known as the Hanoi Hilton, this prisoner of war camp. You have a local man from Rockford, Illinois, who had the experience probably even worse than what McCain had gone through. Tell us a little bit about it.
John Borling, I believe he was a captain at the time. He ended up being a general, and I have 31 hours with the general. So we go into depth into some of these interviews. But there is a few hours we're talking about his experiences first flying out of Thailand in F-4 and then getting shot down, and especially his experience in the Hanoi Hilton. And the distinctive thing about John Borling, what do you do when you're in solitary confinement for years, not months or weeks, years? What he did, he composed poetry. He didn't write it because he didn't have anything to write on, but he composed it, and then they had a tap code. They could tap on the wall and pass messages back and forth to each other, and that was the only way they had to communicate. So he wrote a book of his poetry just a few years ago. He published it, Taps on the Wall. And you're not
Wow.
going to hear him talk about that, but at a significant event, he got shot down, I believe, in '67. So you're cut off from what's going on in the United States. And he gets called in and is interrogated at a very rough interrogation, but then I kind of leave it as a teaser to what he discovers when he's in there.
Okay, let's take a look.
July of '70, I'm getting hammered for some reason. I mean, just ripped apart. I don't even remember what it was. And they've got me all tied up. I still have my lockpick. I'm in the handcuffs, but I've loosened them up. And they've got me in leg irons. I can't get the leg irons done, but I can scoot. And they had me in ropes, but the ropes were loose. And they left me alone, and I was in this room with a desk. And I got over to the desk, scooted over, and opened it up. It was full of letters. So I ripped all the letters, and I'm looking at all the letters, trying to figure out, if there's one for me in there. There's one for a guy who's 2 cells down. So I opened that real quick, and it's a letter from his wife, divorcing him. I put that back, never told him. She did. And I'm looking at letters, and there wasn't anything there for anybody else that I knew or that I had contact with, or that for me. And about this time they hit me. Well, I wasn't going to let any of this stuff go. I'm still doing this. I did manage to scrunch the things down again, and they come in. Oh God, they're insane, and they jump me, and they're ripping the stuff out of my hands. And the last thing they rip out of my hands is a letter, an envelope, and there's a stamp on the envelope. Man on the Moon. And I look at that, and the next thing I know, I'm being beat down, rifle butts and stuff. Oh, they went crazy. And a couple weeks later, I don't know. I don't know why. I don't even remember what what the thing was. I didn't give them what they wanted. Maybe it was a delegation visit. I don't know. But I didn't give it to them. But they kept me there, and they hurt me a lot. They switched stuff out and ropes and things, and they finally just threw me back into the cell. And I was alone in this cell, and really kind of hurting, but I had news, and I tapped on the wall. I said, and I remember exactly what I tapped. We own the moon. And we didn't know. This is 1970, a year later. And you can't, even now I get an operatic chill that, God, we own the moon. And that message, there was a big, this was still in the zoo, and the message went out. So this was 70 pre-Sante, and they had a big move out of the camp, but that message spread like wildfire. and we'd had no contact, this group of us, with anybody who was shot down in 69 or 70. And said, I saw Stamp with a man on the moon.
Mark, you can only imagine what that news, the moon, going to the men on the moon, must have felt like to him after this grim 6 years of existence and torture.
And if you just listen to this little clip, and I had lots of time with General Borling, but just even in this little clip, you get the sense, boy, here is the epitome of what you would expect from a fighter pilot in the Vietnam War, isn't it? And to hear him talk about this experience, we own the moon. Oh. That was powerful.
Yeah, and to be able to share it with the rest of the prisoners there. I mean, I guess they had this tapping down to a science. It was sort of like Morse code or something. They knew how to do it. So he's not only passing poetry back and forth, he's got some real news.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the poetry, after he got out, one of the first things he did was start writing this down. And people, his fellow cellmates would say, no, that's not how the poem went.
We know it better than you do.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So there is good news. Even in the Hanoi Hilton, there was good news. The next fella is also a Vietnam story. And I don't think that the story is probably as well told as it should about the people that felt like they needed to get out of Vietnam before the communists absolutely took over and it got locked down. But there was a lot of that, wasn't there?
Well, in fact, this is Patrick Lam, and this is after the communists had gained control. His family was living in Ho Chi Minh City. His father had been an interpreter for the American Army, had been killed a couple years before that. But they're desperate, and they have no future. I mean, especially, the father who's no longer there, the communists would have known that he was associated with the Americans. And so how do you raise 3 or 4 or 5 children? Patrick was the oldest son. He was 8 years old at the time. Wow. And his mother decided, there's no future for us here. We're going to try to get Patrick out. We're not going to send the whole family out because this is a very, very chancy prospect. That maybe only half of the people who try this are going to survive the experience. But Patrick's aunt and her husband, his uncle, and several other children and a few other members of the family all got into this boat with, I think, 200 or 300 people in this rickety old boat out in the middle of the South China Sea, just hoping that somebody's going to pick them up. And they finally ran into an oil derrick. I think it was an Esso oil derrick. And you're going to hear Patrick talk about it. The rule was the Esso can't rescue everybody off the boat. They have to jump in the water first if they want to be rescued.
Wow. Okay, let's take a look.
No food, no water. It was desperate, but luckily we ran into this oil rig. And the oil rig official, I would say captain of that oil rig, told our boat captain to sink the boat so they can convert that into a rescue mission. Because of political reasons, they didn't want to take them on board unless it's a rescue. I was told that the boat captain, our boat captain, didn't want to sink the boat because he apparently had some valuable stuff hidden in there. He believed he could maneuver and navigate to a safe place. So all they asked for was food and water before they took off. And luckily my family had flotation device, and we had to make a decision at that time: jump off or stay and continue with that boat. So the final decision was for the 12 members of my family to jump into the water. How they spray out this white chemical to keep the fish away. They call those swordfish. And they were big. We saw it later after we got on the oil rig. But we were bouncing that water. The oil rig didn't lower the basket to rescue us until our boat were out of sight. Our boat got out of sight. Then they lowered this big crane. It was like a basket, catching people or supplies. They lowered down the water, and then we all hopped onto it. And they lifted us up, and then we were on board this oil rig. And we were so happy. My aunt and uncle were in tears. The uncle that helped translate it, he again married to my aunt, and he helped us communicate with the people on board the oil rig. And my first impression was we're at least out of the water. They gave us blankets, and they brought us apples and eggs, which I couldn't eat the eggs because after being at sea for a while, you couldn't get anything heavy inside. But the apple was delicious. I've never had an apple growing up in Vietnam. This was the first time, looking at this apple and wow, look at this fruit. and I kept it and just ate it slowly at a time for the whole night we were there. So it was an quite a exciting moment to be rescued and know that at least you're out of the water, being saved, thinking that we're going to go to America.
Well, I'm dying to know what happened to the rest of the family, or do you know?
Oh yeah, they eventually got to the United States. Patrick did, and then he was able to petition and get the rest of the family out a couple years later, I believe. And they settled in Texas, and then they moved up to Chicago. And Patrick now is a physician.
Is that right?
Yeah, but he's no longer working as a physician. He's working for the Department of Revenue, of all places.
Is that right? But they live in or he lives in Illinois.
He does. He lives in Springfield.
So he was an 8-year-old boy when he was when he was rescued, and then at what point he was able to bring the rest of the family over?
I don't know the exact time that occurred, but it been a few years later. It took a little while before he got himself and some of the other family members to the United States.
Wow, it's a remarkable story.
Yeah.
It is remarkable.
And one thing I want to mention here is the Library of Congress has a huge collection of veterans interviews. But I discovered recently their veterans interviews have to be with veterans. Well, we've got people like Patrick talking about the Vietnamese. We've got wives of veterans talking about the experiences of what that was like. So I think in that respect, we've got something on the Library of Congress.
Yeah. You've got a very well-rounded archive. We are about to hear from a lot of people in Springfield know Admiral Thunman. I met him years ago. He probably doesn't remember me, but I remember him. And a lot of people know him and know that what a quality individual this guy is.
Nils Ron Thunman goes to the Naval Academy, graduates in '54, and early in his career he got involved with submarines, and that was about the time that nuclear submarines were coming along. So he spent the bulk of his career with nuclear submarines. He commanded an attack submarine, he commanded the entire submarine fleet in the Pacific, and at the time we're going to be talking about here, he is the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Submarine Warfare, working in the Pentagon.
Wow.
One of the top positions in the Pentagon. And this particular story, this is early 80s, and they've got this contract with John Ballard to go find a couple sunken submarines. And Ballard is trying to convince him, Admiral, come on, can't we use some of that time and money to go looking for the Titanic? And Thunman says, are you crazy? You can't do that. And Ballard kept working on him. So we're going to catch the tail end of that story where Thunman's sitting in his office and somebody comes in and says, hey, you got John Ballard on the phone.
Okay.
In my office, and my chief of staff came in and said, Bob Ballard's on the Marine telephone. He wants to talk with you. And I was a little upset. I didn't want him to communicate from sea. I didn't want the Soviets to be able to detect him at sea. I said, what do you want? And he very quickly said, we found it. And I said, you found what? It's been a year since I think I'd talked to him. He said, well, I can't tell you, but we want to meet you in Portsmouth when we come in and meet with the press. And click. And I sat down and I thought for a minute, and I said, my God, we found the Titanic.
We found the Titanic.
We found the Titanic. And I feel bad now because I was talking about John Ballard. No, it's Bob Ballard. That's who was out there looking for the Titanic. But, can you find a more intriguing story in the 19th or early 20th century American history than the Titanic? We've made several movies about it, and here's General Thunman, Admiral Thunman, involved in finding the darn thing.
And okay, so we landed a man on the moon. We found out about that, and we also found out that we found the Titanic. So we've got all kind of discoveries, don't we?
And we had that little encounter with the woman at the end of World War II singing Lily Marlene.
Verboten. Well, this has been great. You said something earlier that really sort of brought home what 1,000 oral histories is. In some cases, it's not just an interview, it's 30 or 40 hours of interviews, and that's one interview, right? That's one person. So the oral history is 1,000, maybe a little misleading because it's a lot more work than it may appear.
Close to 3,000 hours of interview that we've got, and not all of that is posted. I have a handful of people that are restricted for one reason or another, but most of it is either already posted and some that are in the process because we're constantly adding to the collection.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Mark Depew, thank you for sharing these with us and with our viewers. These are things that are available, but a lot of people don't get around to getting to them, and so if they're watching Illinois Stories, they get a chance to see a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. And again, all of these, as he said, 1,000 interviews are all available for free at the website www.oralhistory.illinois.gov. I'm Mark McDonald in Springfield. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.